Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Reboot Ideas. I'm Stephanie Lepp. I am a proud new member of the Reboot Network, class of 22, and I'm the executive producer at the Center for Humane Technology, where I work closely with Aza Raskin, but we'll get to that in a moment. First and foremost, for those of you who are new to Reboot, Reboot is a Jewish arts and culture organization that reimagines Jewish thought and ideas for the wider world. Reboot is grounded in the belief that Judaism is rooted in the past, responding to the present, and creating a better future. Reboot Ideas is a program of Reboot which hosts Jewish conversations animated by our deepest questions. Who am I? What have I inherited? And what shall I do with it? And these questions, of course, are very much in theme with the high holiday season that we are about to enter. And that brings us to our conversation this evening with two brilliant people. Laurie Segall is a veteran technology journalist and an entrepreneur. As CNN's senior technology correspondent, she interviewed some of the world's most influential technology leaders and won numerous awards for her investigative reporting. And after a decade of covering tech, she recently launched ... which is a media company exploring the intersection of technology and humanity. She is also the author of the new book, Special Characters: My Adventures with Tech's Titans and Misfits. Aza Raskin is a dark matter physicist, that is a true story, and an entrepreneur. He took 3 companies from founding to acquisition before co-founding the Center for Humane Technology, which is the organization at the heart of the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And that is also the organization where Aza has the great pleasure of working with me on our podcast, Your Undivided Attention. Aza is also the co-founder of the Earth Species Project, which is an open source collaborative nonprofit dedicated to decoding animal communication. So if our digital lives had perhaps not a whistleblower, but a shofar blower, if our digital lives had a, let's say, a Jewish-inspired digital reckoning, who would be blowing that shofar? Well, we could say that Laurie Segall and Aza Raskin might be blowing that shofar. And this evening, Laurie and Aza are going to be, let's say, blowing that shofar for us, inspiring that Jewish digital reckoning for us on the topic of Web3, hate groups, and how the two might intersect. How might hate groups weaponize Web3 for their own purposes? If technology is neither inherently good, nor inherently bad, nor neutral, then what is it? How do we understand what it is? How do we understand what Web3 is and what its implications are? And to quote my favorite philosopher of technology, Langdon Winner, by far the greatest latitude of choice exists the very first time a particular instrument, system, or technique is introduced. So how might we take advantage of this window of opportunity in order to responsibly steward Web3? These are the kinds of questions that we will be exploring this evening. And the way that this is going to work is that Laurie and Aza will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will open it up to Q&A. As we go along, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I will hand it over to Laurie and Aza.
Yay, thank you, Steph. Aza, it's great to be here with you. I feel like this is our tradition. And I feel like, by the way, as I'm beginning to talk to you, my computer's slowing down just like out of purpose because it's like afraid for everything that's about to come and all the things.
It's like, enough.
It's like everything we're about to talk about. But I'm excited to be here and chatting with you again. To give folks who are listening like context, we always sit and have these dinners where we just talk about all of the crazy things happening in technology and all the things that could go wrong. And oftentimes I leave scared, but also optimistic too. So I guess to get it out of the way, first of all, I mean, you had a great intro, but like head of user experience at Mozilla Labs and like lead designer for Firefox, you like really had like this imprint on the internet, which is really cool. You're now co-founder of Center for Humane Technology. You're building machine learning to decode animal language, because why would you lead a boring life? But like, we got to go back to the beginning. And before we get into Web3, I feel like everyone should know the context, which is like, you are the person that is behind the infinite scroll. So like, when we are scrolling endlessly on our phones, and we come away being like, oh man, like, you can just scream, Aza, why? You know, why did you design that? And so I feel like, because it's also a moment of reckoning, right, and atonement, how much time wasted do we think you're responsible for before we get into it?
My gosh, I feel like the infinite scroll is one of like so many things I've invented, and like that's the one that always gets picked up. And my biggest fear is that I'm going to get to the end of my life, and on my tombstone is going to be Heath scrolled, like he had a massive thumb. But I actually think the infinite scroll is a really interesting story, because it shows how user experience as a profession, design as a profession, can be locally moral and globally amoral. That is what I was working on back then, was thinking about, well, you know, as a designer, I have failed when I ask the user to make a decision they don't care about, right? So scrolling means I haven't found what I'm looking for, so just show me some more stuff. And so it can be in service of us as a utility. And what I missed is that every time you invent a new technology, at the same time, you're inventing a new trap. You're inventing if I don't use it, somebody else will, because all of the sort of social technology, the engagement companies, right? They're in an arms race for figuring out who can get the most engagement from us. So that means infinite scroll is going to be picked up by those companies, because if YouTube doesn't do autoplay, then TikTok will, and now YouTube is forced to do it. If Facebook doesn't do infinite scroll, but Instagram does, Facebook is forced to do it. And so infinite scroll became a pawn in a greater game of engagement. And unless you invent at the same time as you deploy a technology, the kind of cultural infrastructure that will bind its use, no matter what you invent, it will always be co-opted by the ecosystem, the perverse incentives it lives within, and abused. And so of everything I've ever invented, infinite scroll now sits in the pockets of 4.6 billion people, and it makes them scroll 1,000 times more than they would normally. I actually haven't done the calculation in a long time. Last time I did it was wasting 1 million human lifetimes, I think every day. And that number has just...
Say that again, it's wasting how many?
I think it was on the order of 1 million human lifetimes per day.
I just go back and to that. How old were you when you did it? When you were designing this?
I think I was 26, 25, something around there.
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, by the way, and it makes a lot of sense, obviously, but knowing what you know now and looking at the work you do now, which is all about responsible design, and it almost feels like your life is a reaction, to reversing some bit of the infinite scroll. What would you go tell that guy? What would you say? Would you have invented it? Sorry, I don't mean to put you in the hot seat. It's just, we have
here's the fascinating thing. I don't actually hold infinite scroll very strongly in my identity, because it's the kind of thing that was going to get invented. So if I could go back and talk to that version of me, it would have been to do what I was just talking about. Understand that that your good intentions will be co-opted by a larger game, and be very aware of becoming a pawn in the greater engagement game.
Sure.
So there's a turn where human-centered design misses that it puts human bugs at the center, and that we as human beings would become the commodity, the most valuable commodity, like our behavior. And actually, I was going back and looking at some of the quotes from Esther Dyson and Kevin Kelly about what they thought the internet, Web 1.0 was going to be like, and then Web 2.0. So let me just read you this. This is from Esther Dyson. She said, the fundamental thing the net does is to overcome the advantages of economies of scale so that the big guys don't rule, right? Like, how naive was that?
I mean,
I think I was caught in that naivety.
I understand it, because if I look back at when I started covering technology, like I think back to 2010, right? This is when, now it's called Web 2, but then it was like social and mobile. The rise of social mobile was happening. And I just remember people weren't really looking at entrepreneurs. I was at CNN, new in the newsroom, no one was paying attention. And I was like trying to convince like my bosses at the time, I was like, we got to put this guy, he founded this thing called Twitter. We got to put him on like television. And I would literally like try to hack my own system to get the founders of Instagram on, and Uber and all this stuff, because there was just this idea that technology then felt kind of punk rock, right? It was going away from the system. It was like, no, we're coming out of the recession. It's not just cool to go to Wall Street. There's this creative class of human beings who are just like doing it. Like they're building new industries. They're getting around the system. They're getting jobs out there. Like this was so exciting. And as someone for me, I like loved punk rock when I was younger. I was like, this is incredible. And so to a degree, fast forward sitting across from Zuckerberg during Cambridge Analytica, right? Which I think there's a bit of that in the social dilemma where it's like, what went wrong, Mark, right? You see exactly what you're saying, which is that it just didn't end up being what we thought it was going to be. And so like, what can we learn from that? And I think about that as we enter a new era of the web, which is like Web 3, right? And we have like over the last year, I think we kind of covered it the last time we spoke, but it was like Web 3 was beginning to kind of bubble up. People were talking about NFTs and the metaverse. And, and here we have this utopian idea again of like the tech companies have gotten too big and powerful. We've all watched The Social Dilemma and seen like what went wrong. And now there's this new generation of the internet coming where there's digital ownership. There's the metaverse that's going to give access to everybody and these more immersive worlds. There's blockchain, which can give us this decentralized financial construct. And then there's a part of me that's like, oh no, like we're already doing the thing, guys. Like no one's paying attention. We're already repeating the same mistakes. So to get into that, I would just say like, what do you think about the nature of like Web 3 as a whole? Like, is it here? Is it real? And are we going to repeat the same mistakes that we made last go around with Web 2?
I think there's some real innovations going on in Web 3. And I'm going to start with like some of the positives, because I think we are recapitulating the same mistakes and the same kind of euphoria about we're making a new system, but not being aware of the race and competition dynamics that are going to control the system means that, and this is going to sound a little strong, that despite best of intentions, or what seems to be best intentions, Web 3 is going to end up being mostly a pawn of the engagement economy. So some things that it can do that are really positive. In the best world, I think blockchain can be a real force for transparency and sunlight, right? Like imagine the US government where its entire budget was put in a blockchain, which was verifiable. And then instead of a hope you can believe in from Obama, imagine the next candidate is hope that you can verify. And you can put bounties out for when citizens can find graft or grift rather, or corruption. And you can really have a kind of sunlight and accountability and transparency in a way you can't now. That's exciting.
Right.
But I don't really see people talking about it in that way. There's something I really want to like back up and cover for a second, which is the way that technology changes the context in which we write down our values. And then the way we write down our values, sort of like the letter of our values, diverges from the spirit of our values. And like the values become zombie values. Let me give a couple examples of this because it's a little abstract. So an example is, if you look in the Constitution, there is no right to privacy in there. That wasn't a necessary thing at the time the Constitution was written.
Right.
The right to privacy came around with Brandeis, who became a Supreme Court judge. And at the time, I think this was in the late 1800s, 1890 or so, the first mass-produced camera by Kodiak was put into market. At the same time as newspapers were able to start printing more cheaply images. And suddenly anyone could take a picture of somebody in power as a wife. This was actually, it turns out privacy was much about like hiding women from the public eye. That's a whole other story. And Brandeis was like, well, we need a new right. We need a right to privacy because otherwise we're going to have this race to the bottom, everyone trying to embarrass everyone else. So technology created the need for a new value. But sometimes it invalidates old values. So here's a way that like free speech as a value has become a zombie value. The thing that it's pointing at is really important. It's pointing at the need for holding power to account. It's pointing at the need for self-expression and for well-functioning democracy. But it was created, it was written down in a time when it was very cheap to listen, but inexpensive. But expensive to speak. It was hard to get distribution. And that's shifted now. Right now, it's really cheap to get your voice out there, but there's so much, it's really expensive to listen. And so that value of free speech cannot stand up to, say, the term amplifaganda, where TikTok, which now controls, it's sort of like the cultural infrastructure for our youth, controls what messages go viral. So tomorrow, China could invade Taiwan, and then China says, well, let's dial up every real American voice, which is saying, well, like, who's to decide? Look at all the bad things America's done. It's part of China anyway. They just make those ones go viral. They downregulate all the other ones. They control social consensus. Nothing illegal has happened. That's a autoimmune disease against a zombie value of free speech. And we have to update our values. And so my big worry about Web3 is it's operating on these old zombie values. Let's say data. It's all about protect my data, data sovereignty. But data, honestly, is a backwards looking thing. It's almost like Web3 thinks is going to the future, but it's backing up into the future. And what do I mean by that? Two examples. Like, we've moved in with AI to an inference economy. So I can predict things about you without needing much data. Gloria Marx found that she can predict your top 5 personality traits. Ocean, 85% as well as, like, I think that number is right, as like doing a long test just by looking at how you move a mouse around the screen, not even what content is there. Or with a VR, I was talking to Jeremy Cogburn from Stanford, and he was saying it just takes 20 seconds of your head moving around in a VR headset to uniquely identify you. So what is protecting data in a world when we can make inferences? They're protecting the wrong flag. It's the flag from last century, not this century. And so it's not really meeting the moment.
It's like, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. And I want to unpack all of it. I think maybe it might actually be helpful. I feel like I'm so inside baseball sometimes when it comes to even talking about like Web3, like, how would you, like, in the most basic terms, describe Web3 to the folks who are watching? I can try to do it too, but I feel like you'll do it in a better way.
Well, why don't, actually, I'm really curious. Like, I think you've probably had to describe Web3 more recently than I have. So why don't you start, and then I'll add
okay,
on.
I'm going to start and then just kind of like jump in with like very smart commentary on it. So if you think about Web 1, right? Like, as the rise of the internet websites, the .com boom, right? And where we kind of democratized the internet. Very interesting time. Then you had Web 2, which was like the mobile phone came out, and you had social media, and all of these industries were born, right, from Web 2. But it was this idea that, like, we gave up a lot of our data to participate, right? Like, we gave up our data to Facebook, we gave up our data to Instagram. And if Instagram were to go away tomorrow, and if Facebook were to go away tomorrow, like, well, by the way, they're one and the same. So if they were all to go away tomorrow, our data would go away with it, right? So like, it's almost like they own you, right? And so then if I'm looking at Web3 or this like vision of Web3, it's this idea that you own you, right? That like, we have with NFTs and digital ownership, more ownership over ourselves, right? We are able to, and I also say it's almost more of like an immersive world too. It's this idea that tech is almost moving, could be moving beyond the screen, right? Not just VR, we're talking AR. People are growing up, your children are growing up in video games. And it's not even the idea that they're just playing video games. They have communities, they have avatars, they have identities. And also then you add this idea of digital ownership and NFTs, which is kind of a newer concept, but that means that they have these identities where they can place value on their items in these worlds and take them to different worlds. So it's super, maybe I don't know if I was like super wonky with it, but I think it's kind of based off of digital ownership and blockchain and more immersive worlds that we will grow up in. Like our children will have jobs that we didn't even know existed in these digital spaces, right? And I don't think it's going to be like Neil Stephenson putting on a headset and then like, you know, it's no crash, like, and then like we're putting on a headset and we're just in Mark Zuckerberg's like metaverse. I think that like this is even the idea that we're so comfortable speaking over Zoom now. This is more immersive. Like we as human beings will be more used to these immersive worlds. And so I think this is kind of this next generation of technology. So now go in and pick that apart and make it even clearer.
No, I thought that was great. I love situating in terms of Web 1.0, Web 2.0, Web 3.0. And I think it really gets to the heart of the problem, because Web 3.0 to me is often defined around this, like you own your own data.
That's
so
right.
You show up at a website, you get to decide who sees your data, and importantly, when they use your data, you get paid for it. And this sounds really empowering, right? Like that you get paid for when somebody uses your data, and that means, you know, Facebook wouldn't make as much money as they did if it was Web3. Instead, all that money would go back to the people who are actually participating in the platform. It sounds really utopian until you realize that owning your data, as I said, is sort of like a zombie value. Because to go back to the TikTok example, right? Biden sort of like took Trump's TikTok ban and sort of like updated it and said, okay, we're not banning them, but like we're going to put strong guarantees and locks around what TikTok can do with your private data. And what that misses, of course, is that amplifaganda that I just talked about, that it doesn't matter who has your data if what's affecting policy and popular opinion, and hence what like actions we take as a nation, can be manipulated with, you know, which content gets raised up. Where has somebody breached your data? That hasn't happened. And so in the Web3 world, they're making the same mistake as the Biden administration, which is saying, well, it's about owning your data, and now the world is falling apart, but at least you're getting paid for it. Like that's sort of like the problem.
And it's like, I have this thing that's in my head that it feels like we're still talking about how to regulate Meta / Facebook, right? And it feels to some degree, sometimes when I talk to people who about technology, I'm like, God, it feels like all these folks have just left the crime scene and they're off like creating this better internet. And they've left this kind of mess behind, and they're about to do this whole new thing. And I don't think people understand. So I think what I'm taking from what you're saying is like, we've been sitting here talking about the business model of Web 2 and the fundamentals of like Twitter and Facebook, or all of this type of stuff. It's the fundamental business model that's at the heart. It's broken. But what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like, it's not just about your data. Like give up on this idea of privacy, because like privacy is what you're like, it's like a zombie value. Is that what I'm hearing from you to some degree? Like we have bigger fish to fry, and they're coming, and like people aren't even aware of it. So if we're looking at the bigger fish, right? Like here's data and privacy and like Cambridge Analytica world, and that was 2018. Fast forward 2022, we are more online than ever. We have all kind of opted in with the pandemic. So data's here. Like what are the bigger fish to fry? Like what is the thing now that is keeping you up at night?
Yeah, this is exactly it. It's not that privacy doesn't matter. It's not that owning your data doesn't matter. It's that those are values pointing at something that's really important, but like the spirit of the law has diverged from the letter of the law. So we need to figure out like, how do we articulate the things we really care about that isn't in the form of this zombie value? So even saying like it's the business model that's the problem, I think misses it. And even though that's what we were sort of saying in the social dilemma, it's that, we as human beings are the commodity now. So, there's a line that Justin Rosenstein says in The Social Dilemma, which is, so long as a whale is worth more dead than alive, and a tree is worth more as lumber than a tree, then so too we human beings will be worth more disinformed, polarized, angry, and narcissistic than as full human beings. And that doesn't really change with Web3. There will continue to be a arms race on who can engage us most. And Web3 doesn't really give a solution to that. In fact, it sort of makes it worse, because right now, at least there are a couple centralized companies that would be easier to regulate. We go to them and say, hey, do this thing. Web3, it's out. There's no centralized place to regulate. And like, Larry Lessig has said that code is law. Smart contracts, like these things are written in such a way that once you put it out into the world, you can't do an undo. And so whatever we put out, we can't take back. And that's pretty scary.
I had interviewed a guy recently. He's a partner at Galaxy Digital, which invests in quite a few like crypto companies. And I was like, well, what's the single most important ethical issue that you need to be thinking about, that like people need to think about more? And he said to me, he's like, I think we should operate under the assumption that in the future, everything we see on the internet will be fake. Like we have to operate under the assumption that everything will be fake. What do you make of that?
I think he is right. We're sort of heading towards this trust jubilee. And I want to sort of slow down for the audience here, because something really profound has happened in the AI space. In really the last 2 years is when the acceleration has begun, but since January of this year. And the reason why I have to slow down is because this is so far outside of the realm of what we're used to that it's hard to get your mind around it unless you've played with it. So what am I talking about? There is OpenAI came out with something called DALL-E or DALL-E 2, and Google then followed up with ImageGen. And now there's an open source version called Stability AI, and there's another company called Midjourney, where you can type whatever you want, anything, and within a couple of seconds, it will generate that image. So you can say like astronauts riding a horse with a rainbow in the background in the style of Van Gogh, and it makes it, and it's pretty convincing. And one of the first things I typed into one of these systems was hashtag breaking explosion over Kiev, and it returned a semi-infinite number. I could just hit generate of rather photorealistic images of what like explosions in Kiev, like is from the front cover of the New York Times. The funny thing, I made actually a music video to some music that my partner had written, and is entirely using this technology. It's this very sort of like beautiful, trippy kind of thing. It actually TED showed it this year because it's like the fact that you could make a music video that looked like it was hand animated. People couldn't tell it wasn't hand animated, but I did it in 24 hours. Like that was so surprising. They're like, let's show it. And even though I would show the video to journalists when they wanted to talk about it, and then I would show them the prompts that had made the video, they couldn't wrap their minds around it. They would sort of be like, oh, wow. And then they would forget. And so I'm aware that when I'm trying to like tell this story to the audience, it's going to be a hard thing to grasp that in this year, AI has crossed this new fundamental threshold where you can generate images that feel profound, that feel beautiful, that move me, that are photorealistic. So suddenly, and now it's starting to work for video, so you can just type in and it generates a video based on your description. In the next, I mean, really it's now, but as it gets out into the general public, in the next, like half a year to 18 months, like video and photographic evidence ceases being meaningful.
Wow.
which is a crazy thing to say.
Coming from like a news standpoint, like having spent a decade at CNN, you're at 2 years at 60 Minutes, like, it's hard to like fathom, right? Like, we already have to think about misinformation, but I don't think people wrap their heads around the idea that this is coming and it's coming so quick. We're going to have create technology that helps verify. I mean, what is the solution to some of this stuff? Like, how will news organizations, like, how will they cope with this? And also, like, what does this mean for the future of truth?
Yeah, these are great questions. And so, of course, there's going to be a cat and mouse game where there's going to be technology invented, and there is technology out there now to try to determine which is fake and which is real. But then you just have AI versus AI, and the AI has access to the technology that knows when something's fake, and it can keep like laddering up. So we're going to get an arms race there, but that's never going to fix the doubt problem, which is you're always gonna be like, well, do I really trust that it's fake or not fake? Maybe this one got around it. So I think we're going to move to a world where like we will, and this is the hopeful version of this story. Yes, this will be a neutron bomb for the internet and neutron bomb for trust. And by the way, this isn't just in video and in text. And fun things you can do. I mean, these things are super fun to play with. I can take a video of you, Laurie, and I can say, okay, take this video, but actually do it again, but where she's smiling. Now do it again where she's frowning. And it just re-renders it. So it's like you can do these micro changes. It doesn't have to be and generate a whole new thing. This is also now starting to become available for text. So already, like at the paragraph to like 3 paragraph to 4 paragraphs level, it's coherent enough that I can't really tell when something's written by a human or written by a computer. So narrative and like visual art are the first things that AI is coming for. Now, what this means is that we're going to go through this, like, I think, a trust jubilee where we are going to learn that we can't trust things on the internet. And that creates an opportunity for some kind of verified internet. And what does that mean? That means like each person like has their own identity, like they get signed, you signed your content when you make it, maybe your phone, like the iPhone, like it signs at the time that you take the photo with the depth map. So you can't just take a picture of a picture, like this was verified, taken on a real photo. And now only nation state actors will be able to like generate things that appear as if they were real. This, I think, where blockchain could be really interesting is some kind of like verified chain of like who created what. It will only work as well. One, a whole bunch of things come up here. One, this will work for limiting the amount of like AI generated stuff on the internet, but as long as I can like type, I can always type something that the AI has generated. And 2, now we're moving back into this world of like everyone has to have a strong identity that can push us really quickly towards more authoritarian style regimes. And so we're going to have to invent new philosophical distinctions for how do we do verification and identity in a way that doesn't break our other values. And these, again, are conversations I'm not really seeing done in a systematic way.
You know, the thing that keeps me up at night, I've spent a lot of time for work with conspiracy theorists, and like during the pandemic, I embedded with folks from QAnon and militia groups and neo-Nazis and all sorts of people, right, who have, who I think are also, on the other side of the algorithms. God, like I see the rabbit hole people go down, and I look at specifically with QAnon, the do your own research is kind of their tagline, and meeting a lot of these people who there's a lack of trust in democracy and institutions. There's all these different factors, and then you end up with a lot of these folks finding community in these places with the idea that you can do your own research. You add the internet, where you can find your answer to anything. Now add this new type of technology, right, where it can actually generate whatever you're looking for, and you really begin to build out these conspiracy groups. And I think that's scary to me. And one of the things that I think is the scariest about Web3, and then I promise I'll pull it back, and I know we have an audience question. At that time, I had become a Q drop, right? And a Q drop, for folks listening, is when whoever Q was at the time would post on on some, board, some kind of conspiracy, and they had called me a domestic enemy because they didn't like the piece that came out. And so I was harassed for weeks, right? Which is, it's the job. It's, it's not the end of the world, but it's certainly an unpleasant couple of weeks. Now I think about one of the things that Web3 has to offer, which is like a DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous network, which for folks listening, it's this idea of almost like a group chat with a balance sheet, like run on crypto, right? And then people are talking about like network states, which are like crypto network states that, that are super interesting. And I think what happens when QAnon gets a DAO, right? Like what happens when these groups that are really extreme begin to adapt some of these new technologies, that I think a lot of the early adapters oftentimes do have more distrust in, in the government or whatever it is. And so whereas there's this utopian picture being painted, and I think a lot of great uses will come of it, there's also, how are we going to deal with the fact that we have a rise of, domestic terrorism here in the United States? Like there's all sorts of stuff. So I think that's something that I don't think has been addressed that's coming when it comes to the future of conspiracy. So that's keeping me up at night.
Totally. Well, and this is sort of my point about infinite scroll, is that I was making a technology blind to the larger power game that it was going to be picked up by. And I think Web3 is doing the same thing. It's like, cool, you make this technology that lets a decentralized group of people come together in a generally non-visible way to other folks. You can like power it now with a whole bunch of money in this sort of DAO sense. Of course, they're going to be good actors, and they're going to be really interesting, like grassroots, pro-social things that come out of it. But it's also going to be used by the people who are just playing the power game. And so, two thoughts to add on there. One is, Johan Hari has this beautiful quote that the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And the thing that I think people are missing that gets them to join QAnon is like a lack of connection. They're looking for other people that feel the same kind of way. And what does technology do? It sort of replaces real connection with this sort of like brittle fake version of connection. So when you live in a hypo-normal world, when like you're not getting enough stimulation, then suddenly the hyper-normal stimuli, the things that are super sugary, become even more sugary.
Right.
As AI continues to go up and as the world becomes continually more independently complex, what happens when the human mind encounters systems it doesn't understand? Well, one of the things it does is that it turns towards religion and spirituality. And what we should expect then, as there are more and more things that are computing at roughly the level of the human mind or more, is we should expect a massive spike in spirituality and religion. And some of that now that's sort of up for grabs as a new commodity. Some of that is going to be, a lot of it's going to be taken over by more conspiratorial, QAnon-y kinds of things. And the thing I want to layer on top of this, just to make it even more terrifying, is we need to stop saying the word chatbot, because chatbot makes you think about like the 1990s and like terrible customer service bots that don't really understand. There is, earlier this year, the first instance of a very smart Google engineer getting fired from his job because he had formed a relationship with his chatbot, a language model. And he believed it was such an important relationship to him that he was fighting for its rights and going public, and he lost his job over it. The interesting question is not, was it sentient or not? The interesting question is, will other people feel the same way as this very smart Google engineer? The answer is, of course, yes. This wasn't a chatbot, this was a synthetic relationship. We are going to continue to have synthetic relationships. There's a paradigm shift in computing about to happen where we are going to be doing everything in voice, everything in text. We're going to be talking to our computers like, hey, I'm listening to some music. This sounds really nice. Instead of looking up a new thing on a playlist, you'll say, oh, this is great, but can you make it more like like desert vibes with a little bit of like nostalgic purple, and it'll do it. It'll learn how to do things like this. And this is, coming in the next 6 months to 12 months. So what we are going to have these kinds of synthetic relationships. And here's a question for you. Like, there are these things called love scams, where people get on Tinder, somebody like finds them, they get into like a relationship. They never meet in person, but suddenly the person's like, oh, this bad thing happened to me. I need some some money, or I need like a gift card.
Yeah.
And you know how much money was scammed? Reported. So there's more big, this is bigger last year.
Oh my God, I don't know. Hundreds of millions. I don't know, a lot.
Yeah, exactly. $500 million. And it is growing exponentially. So the year before it was like 200 million. The year before it was only like 50 million.
It doesn't surprise me.
Right. So by 2025, it's going to be like, I think 4 billion or something big like that. What does this mean? Well, right now this is happening manually. You're going to be able to automate this stuff. Loneliness becomes the largest national security threat, because relationships are the most persuasive form of technology human beings have got. And we are not prepared for a world where you can spin up 1 million friends, A/B test them, find all the lonely people and bring them to QAnon, fundraise from them, steal from them, or just manipulate their beliefs. Because if you have a friend that believes something, over time, they're going to be able to convince you of it to some degree.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the future of misinformation for elections, right? We have one person in the audience who asked, they said, are there examples of AI created video, audio, photos that have tricked people? I'm imagining how this might be used in election campaigns. I mean, it's my fear that we're just at the beginning of this. We saw like the Obama deep fake back in the day, and that just feels like old now, right? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, all those things definitely exist. And right now it's in that sort of like fun open source thing. So you can go online, you can find like Google Colabs, which are essentially notebooks that you click, they run in the cloud. And, last night I was playing around with generating some new images and trying out to make some sort of fake news kind of stuff. And it's working great. So the answer is yes, it's all coming. Actually, it's not even coming. It's sort of here. It's just not distributed yet.
Also goes to Sally's question. She says, what is the future for creative professionals as AI develops even further? Will AI be able to create truly original art and literature? I say this from like a news standpoint. Will AI be able to tell the news, right? Like what do you think, like how far will we go? And do you think, I'm going to just add on to that, is it possible for there to be a world where AI and humans have a symbiotic relationship, or will one need to be more powerful than the other?
Yeah, these are all great questions. I wish I had a more hopeful answer about the art stuff. The way I normally think about it is, there are two parts of art. There's the noun, the thing you get at the end of the art, and then there's the verb, which is like the making of it, the act of making of it. AI, I think, is going to get 10 years is like such a hedge bet, but like in the next couple of years, it's going to be able to make almost any kind of, like, let's just say visual artifact better than almost every human. And it will feel new. Like, honestly, like people have watched the music video I made and they've cried. It feels really profound.
Yeah.
But AI will never be able to take away the verb, like the act of making it, this version of like expression that we're going to be able to keep. I think we're going to see like artists like that get paid for making things. It'll become a centralized market. Just a few people who have big brands are the ones who can be paid for it. Everything else is going to be sort of commodified. Just going to get used to typing and making a thing. Creators are going to become more like curators. You're going to pay people for their taste because anyone can generate anything. So how do you know whether it's good? Like that, I think will like move. So creators become curators. Copyright, like that's another zombie value that's going to break today. Like I've done this. I've said like, hey, make me a picture, a portrait in the style of Victor Nye or Van Gogh. And I say Victor Nye because she's an incredible artist. She's a friend. And it just took her style very well. I sent the images to her and she's like, yeah, this looks really great, but it makes me feel weird. And note that like she doesn't have any copyright protection over it.
Right.
Yeah, it's very, very challenging. Like we are going to need fundamental new philosophies to deal with it. The problem is, normally you get like an era creating technology, and then there's time for culture to catch up. So I think about the plow and how the plow, created essentially an era. We move into agriculture, but it does something strange. Like technology, a plow has a lot to say about what religious beliefs we can have, because over time, the groups that adopt the plow, the cultures that adopt the plow, get an adaptive advantage. And to the extent that they treat animals as resources to exploit is the extent to which they get a more adaptive advantage. So over time, the cultures that essentially learn to beat their animals are the ones that win. And that means if you're beating your animal to make them work, like, you're probably not going to believe in animism anymore, right? You can't believe in the sacredness of an animal if you have to like force it to work. But at least that happened over many, 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 many generations, and it gave culture a time to like push back. We are not getting that time now. We're getting era creating technology, epoch creating technology so fast, it's almost continuous. Like, I think we're in the post era. That is the era post eras. We've sort of gone into this like calculus. And I think we're going to either need to slow technology down, which seems unlikely, or figure out how to bind these kinds of race conditions of, if we don't do it, somebody else will. To give a really specific example, like all the AI ethicists got together and they're like, well, for these new like image generation technology, we should probably not let it make gory images, and we shouldn't let it show images of people, like people that exist. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That lasted a sum total of 2 months before there was an open source version that didn't have any of those protections.
Right.
And so this is the fundamental problem we need to solve of how do we, it's sort of like after we invented nuclear weapons, we had to invent a new world order, like Bretton Woods, in order to have the multilateral agreements so that we didn't blow ourselves up. And we sort of barely scraped through. We're getting nuclear level technology, these catastrophe weapons that are in everyone's hands, faster than like government can even like keep track of what they're called. And we need to have like whatever that Bretton Woods style thing is for all of these technologies. So that's like that is a new era. And that's where I wish all the Web3 people were sending their attention.
Right. You're saying like we need a new world order for the future of AI and all the things that are kind of coming down the pipeline. I want to get to Ari's question. Ari says, can you speak to the vulnerabilities of people who don't identify as technological early adopters, and thinking about the claims of decentralized web proponents and wondering how they might present for average people, presently disadvantaged people or non-technocrats to be exploited? Good question. I mean, Aza, what do you think? I'm happy to take a stab at it, but.
Yeah, but I feel like I've been talking a lot. I'd love to hear
No, I mean, truthfully, like, I don't feel like Web3 is going to be right now for people who aren't technologically advanced. And I think that's the problem with it. Like, I think there's probably early adapters and early winners and people who are building it who I wish were more diverse, because if they were more diverse and different, they would build out probably a better and more equitable world. But I think right now you have to have a certain knowledge because the protocols aren't 100% there of crypto and a lot of these things to actually get into it. So I worry more about people who aren't technologically advanced being exploited by the normal spam, like what you were talking about with like all these spams for lonely folks, I would say that would be my hot take. How about you?
Yeah, I think that's right, because I think the way most like non-early adopters are going to encounter Web3 is, either some kind of currency which they get sucked into trading, and that acts a little bit like a Ponzi scheme where the people who are in early are going to do better, or it'll look like another app and you won't really know, and maybe it won't have ads, and that'll be really nice, but all of these Web3 companies, if they're a consumer app, are still going to have to compete for attention. So, here's an example of the kind of competition, but in like Web2 land, which is, actually after a whole bunch of, like work and activism from many, many people, YouTube started putting protections on their videos so that, you don't fall down rabbit holes, that you don't go to like a dieting video and you get recommended anorexia videos. It doesn't push you as far down the extremist pipeline. That's awesome. But then TikTok really starts innovating on the short form video. That starts eating everyone's lunch. And YouTube is like, well, we have to compete. So they release short form videos and they take away all of the protections because they have to compete. This kind of thing is going to happen in Web3, except now there's no centralized thing. So my worry is there's still going to be network effects, monopoly effects. There are going to be a couple really big winners, and those winners are going to have to compete in the same engagement game. And so it's not going to be any better for the end user, except maybe they get a little bit of money out of it.
What about, so to try to turn this train around, guys, because, you know, Rosh Hashanah is coming, we have Yom Kippur. We have a question. How can we start rebooting and reimagining Jewish thought and traditions to help us address the challenges that we're talking about? Because I know it feels super dire. I mean, and to give everyone context, like Aza and I, like we are very much like in the, you know, in that world, right, of like looking at a lot of these worst case so we can begin to put this out publicly. I mean, Aza is like literally spending his like life's work on this stuff. So there is optimism. What do you think, Aza, like what can we do to really try to take on some of these challenges and, you know, reimagine some Jewish thought and tradition for it?
Yeah. One of my favorite things about Jewish tradition is its tradition of question asking. And I think in this world that moves so quickly, answers will become out of date quickly. Questions can be immortal. That I think is very, very powerful. And in this case, I'm still honestly figuring out how to talk about it. So like everyone here, you're hearing a pretty raw version because we're working on this in real time. But I keep talking about this sort of this trap or this spiral. One of the things I'm really worried about, we at CHT are really worried about, is this spiral where like engagement economy causes like more extreme things to win, more extreme and polarized people elect more extreme and polarized politicians, and that breaks the ability for them to cohere and do anything like make regulations to tamp down or to protect the technology. And so it's sort of like we've invented this new kind of oil spill. Like, you know, oil companies extract and they spill oil out, and it's terrible. It's a terrible externality, but it doesn't break the ability for government to put regulations on oil companies. But when Facebook or TikTok creates a polarization spill into society, or any of the Web3 companies that end up making it, that breaks the ability for a government to put protections or regulations on technology. And so you end up in this like really bad sort of spiral where we're like spiraling down. And that's really driven by what I've been talking about, this trap, which is if we don't do it, somebody else will, the game theory. And so I think what we have to do to turn this around is figure out that we need to become aware of the trap and then create protections that work at the ecosystem level, not the individual company level. This is a little abstract, I know, but let me give the kind of example for what an Apple could do today. Apple could, they're sort of like a government in the sense they control the operating system and the app store, so they can make a set of rules. Imagine if tomorrow they said, we're going to poll everyone and we're going to ask them, when do you start regretting using these apps? How long does it take before you regret them? People are like, oh, like after 15 minutes or 10 minutes on TikTok, I start regretting, or 15 minutes on Facebook. Or even better, if they then start asking a group of experts, like what are the harms that this product is making in society? Let's just go with regret for now. Then what they can do is they can sort of create a regret tax. which is to say, for whatever amount of time people are using it past the regret threshold, they will take all of that profit, withhold it from the company, and put it into public education, into building public digital alternatives, put it into creating legislation that like binds these kinds of traps. It's actually sort of borrowing a page from the big tobacco playbook, where, you know, in the end, the settlement funded, you know, $100 million a year of public service announcements for why tobacco ends up being really bad for your and collective health. So I think there's a way in which Apple could act as a government, recreate the incentives for what is a profitable company, and that can kickstart a sort of turning around and making a spiral to the top. So that's like the kind of example that we're thinking about.
That's super interesting. And I would just add to that, like, there's so many folks in the Reboot community that are creators and community and drivers of community. And I look at what you guys did with creating the social dilemma, right? Which was a kind of a cultural touchstone. Like, in all fairness, we've been asking a lot of those folks these questions for a long time, but like this documentary that aired on Netflix was seen by a lot of people, but it was also seen by regulators and government, and it helped people. It helped it become more of a national conversation and something that touched everyone. So I think media can also help to some degree, and a lot of the folks in this community, I think, are really empowered. So it seems like there are a lot of things we can do, just to end on kind of a more an optimistic note. And there's a lot of work to do. I mean, I think both of us aren't people who just like, you know, just like brush over these types of things. I think we both are tech optimists, but also can be really pessimistic when looking at things, and we really want to see a better world. So I will end on that. Aza, as always, you are so wonderful to talk to. You're such a great human, and I'm so happy you're like designing our world. And so Francine, back to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Laurie and Aza.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I love talking. Go on,
You guys,
sorry.
thank you so much for coming back. When you were, this last question of how do we reboot, you know, traditions to deal with these things, it was not a planted question. It was an organic question that somebody asked. But it made me think, when you're talking about cycles, like, we have you guys, you've been coming back for the past 3 years, since we sort of all felt like we were locked into our Zoom cages, and we've asked you to ask each other the same questions, and very much say, okay, like, where are we in relationship to technology, and what does it mean? And in that process, we're seeing how our values we need to rethink our values, or relationship to our values. And there is something incredibly Jewish about it, because we come back to the same moment, and we're going into these circles, and we have to really say, well, what does this moment in time mean for us today? And how do we respond to it today? And the solutions that we were giving even last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, no longer apply. And it's getting faster. And it's as if, like, the weekly Parsha reading, we need to be doing those every day, because things are just getting faster, and we need to analyze the same piece of text, the same TikTok, the same technology faster. We have to go back to it again and again and again. So it feels like Groundhog's Day in some ways, but it's not. And you guys, thank you so much. You go to really dark places with us, and we need you to. That's part of our culture too, and part of our tradition, to ask these hard questions, and to leave us with a lot of like new frameworks to think about, and ways for all of us to leave here, have conversations. We invite all of you to share this conversation. We'll give it to you. We'll give you links and whatnot. Share the conversation, ask it in your own communities, come up with solutions, come back to us, let us know what you're thinking about, because we really believe that these kinds of conversations, heard more broadly, replicated, tweaked on by other people, will turn up more solutions. And come back and tell us. In the meantime, over the next few days, you'll get links to Laurie and Aza's amazing work. I have Laurie's incredible book here, talk about an intrepid, brave reporter who grew up with these founders asking these hard questions from the beginning. So I didn't show it long enough, special characters. It's really amazing. And it really is a testament to how you have fiercely gone after these founders and you saw what a lot of us weren't paying attention to. So thank you for that. And thank you for documenting it. I've also given the book to the 20-somethings in my life to show them what it means to bravely go after the things that you believe in. So thank you for that. Maddie Heyman, thank you for producing this podcast. I mean, not podcast, sorry, our Zoom, but we're going to make it so you can all hear it, so you don't have to see our faces all the time. And lastly, if you liked this conversation, Laurie and Aza did an amazing one for us for Shavuot, for Passover. We have more of these on our website. And also we have curated some of our great conversations for the high holidays. We have a high holiday guide. Maddie behind the scenes of our chat is just posting that for you. Download it. It has tons more content for you to share with your communities. And follow us on social media and then get off of it and go take a walk or a hike.
I love that.
Aza and Laurie, you promised you'll come back. It might have to be in 6 months, depending on how things develop.
Still have us, we'll come back.
Exactly. Perfect. And that's it. I thought I would blow the shofar for you, but this is the metaphorical shofar blowing.
Oh, well, it's such a pleasure. It's always so fun, Laurie, to talk to you, even if it goes to very dark spaces. And Francine, I am so appreciative of the spaces that you and Reboot create to have these kinds of like really important dialogues.
Yeah.
Especially with a rudder through history as long as the Jewish tradition.
100%.
Yeah.
That. And Aza, I'm also going to, I guess we're all going to we're going to watch your AI music video too. That's going out too. So I'm excited.
Yeah, we're sharing it.
We're going to feel some real
amazing.
emotions from watching it and look at the future. Thank you, Francine. This is wonderful. We love coming here.
Thank you guys.
Great.
Shana Tova.
Oh,
I wish you all a very sweet new year as you prep for it.
Thank you.
Bye,
guys.
everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have more of these. And come to the next one and tell your friends. Good night, everybody.